Hi everyone, this is Pierrick from P2design. Welcome to part 3 of this mini course series where you will learn how to create an explosion FX using Blender EEVEE. In this video, we will add sparkles and smoke to our real-time explosion. If you've missed the previous video, you will find the link in the description below. Let's get started. Before I start adding detail to my explosion, I will reposition a bit my camera. From the side view, I will move it on the Y-axis to take it further from the explosion. And then from the camera view, I will press R to rotate and X twice to rotate it along its local X-axis. The cool thing with particle system is that we can add as many we want onto a single emitter. What we have in the top panel here are particle system slots, a bit like material slots. And each slot can use a different particle setting or the same particle setting. So I will rename the particle setting we have created in the previous video Explosion Cloud or Explosion Flames. And I will then click the plus icon to create a new particle system slot and a new particle system. And I will call it Sparkles. As I created it, we can see that we have another red line appearing in our timeline. I want those sparkles to burst on frame 5, so I will set the start and end frame to 5. And I will try with a number of 40. I will set a lifetime over 100 frames so that they don't die during our animation. And I will increase the normal speed to 7 and the random speed to 4. As for the cloud, I want some damping, so I will go to the physics tab and I will try with a value of 0.08. Let's play the animation and see how it looks. I have forgotten to disable the gravity, so the particles are falling. So I will go to the field weight and set the gravity to 0. When I now play the animation, the particles are no longer affected by the gravity and are not falling down. I feel like they are way too slow, so I will increase the normal speed to 15 and the random speed to 8. I will also increase the damping to 0.15. I will test different damping value and I will return to the 0.08 value. That was the most convincing value. What would be cool is to have those sparkles to create a slight arc as they are falling down. So I will add a bit of gravity. I will try with 0.1 and then 0.15 and see how it looks. And I feel like it looks pretty cool right now. So let's now create an object that will be rendered instead of those little points. If you want to learn character creation, rigging and animation and take your skill to a professional level, you will find extensive and top-rated Blender courses on my Gumroad page. Hundreds of professionally edited videos shipped with all the models, rig and Blender files. Use the code P2design to get 10% off on any of the courses. First, let's create our sparkle object. In the 3D view, I will press Shift A and add a mesh icosphere. Then I will move it underneath our plane and I will call it Sparkles. Then we will go to the Material tab and we will create a new material that we are going to call Sparkles. As seen in the first video, in the material setting, I will set the blend mode to alpha blend, the shadow mode to none, and I will also activate back face culling. As I do so, the object rendering will look a little better, as we won't be rendering the back faces anymore. Only the faces that are facing the camera will be rendered. From there, in the shader editor, we can get rid of the principal BSDF. Instead, we will add a shader emission shader and a transparent shader. We will mix those with a mix shader, and we will put the transparent shader in the first slot and the emission shader in the second. When the factor is 0, we will have a transparent sphere. When the factor is 1, it's gonna be fully emissive. Let's now bring a bit of color to it. In the shader editor, I will press Shift A and add an input layer weight. To be able to drive the contrast of the layer weight, I will add a converter, color ramp, and I will use the facing output of the layer weight. Then I will Ctrl-Shift left-click the color ramp to see the result. The facing option is like a Fresnel, but it's a little more contrasted. We do see the faces over our object, so I will right-click on it and choose Shade Smooth. Now we can use our color ramp to drive the factor of the mix shader. I will Ctrl-Shift left-click the mix shader. What was black in our color ramp became transparent. What is white is emissive. So I can invert both flags from the color ramp. You can play a bit with the black flag to make the sphere a little more transparent. I will then select the color ramp and press Ctrl-Shift-D to duplicate it and keep the connection with the layer weight node. Now we can create a nice gradient that will go from a bright orange to a bright red. You can now experiment a bit with the strength value of the emission shader. I ended up with a value of 10 for the emission strength. Now that we have our base model and our base material for the sparkles, let's select our emitter object, go to the particle options, and make sure that the right particle system is selected, the second one. Then, as we did in the second video, let's head to the Render tab, choose Render as Object, and in the Instance Object option, choose our Sparkle object. Let's now play our animation to see how our particle now look. I need to zoom into my explosion to see the sparkles because they are very small. So let's increase a bit the scale. Switch to camera view, disable the overlay. This way we have a better preview of the result. And we can tweak the scale of our sparkles to something like 0.05. I will also add some randomness so that all the sparkles don't have the same size. One big issue regarding particle system and EEVEE is that we can't use the particle info node to drive our shader. It still works with cycles, but it has never worked with EEVEE. I don't know what is the plan. Maybe they want to use geometry nodes to drive the particles in the future, but for the time being we will find a way around. To be able to animate our sparkle, we will simply add keyframes upon the strength of the emission shader. So I will crank up the emission to 30 on frame 6 at the beginning of the explosion, press I while hovering over the strength value, and then on frame 25 I will reduce the strength to 10. Since I've enabled the auto keying in the previous video in the timeline, Blender will automatically add a new keyframe. I will then go on frame 90 and set the strength to 0. So now we have very bright sparkles at the beginning of the explosion, and the intensity is getting down as they get older. This is something you would generally drive with the age of your particles in Unity or in Blender if you are using cycles. Now I'd like to be able to control the transparency of the particle. To do so, I will add a converter matte node, and I will drop it just after our color ramp. It will be automatically plugged in, and I will switch the mode to multiply. I will set the multiply value to 1. It's like we are doing nothing. If you multiply anything by 1, it won't change the result. But if I then multiply by 0, whatever the input value, the result will be 0, meaning that our particle will disappear. From there, on frame 70, I can add a keyframe for the value 1, and then go to frame 90, where I want the sparkles to disappear, and set the value to 0. And now the particles are fading. One thing we can do to get a bit of blinking onto our sparkles is to add a bit of randomness to their emission strength but also their transparency. To do so, let's first add a noise texture. Now to drive the texture, let's add an input texture coordinates node. And as we did in the first video, we will use the object coordinates to drive our noise texture. I will source the same object as in the first video, the empty object. And now our noise texture is mapped upon our particles based on the empty position. But it's very hard to see on our particles. So what I will do is that I will add a plane, I will rotate it toward the camera, and I will give it the same material as our sparkle. You don't need to do it, it's just for the demonstration. You can see that the noise on the plane is very small. So let's decrease the scale in the noise texture so that the noise appears bigger. I will then add a converter color ramp so that we can give a bit of contrast to the noise and better see what we are doing. Since our plane is using the empty object coordinates, as I move it in space, the noise texture seems to be sliding upon the plane. And so it will have exactly the same behavior with the particles. So let's get rid of the plane and see how we can use it with the particles. You can see that some of them are black, others are gray, and others are white. To better demonstrate, I will change the color to a green to a red range, so that you can see that some of the particles change color. So now let's use the noise texture to drive a map range node. As seen in the first video, it's going to give us more control than the color ramp. So let's plug in the noise texture. With the default value of the map range node, our noise is not super contrasted. So it's hard to clearly see it. To contrast it, we just need to take the from min and from max value and make them closer to 0.5. If I set them to 0.4 to 0.6, I can now clearly see black dots, white dots, and gray dots. So now let's use this result to modify our emission shader. To do so, we will add a converter math node set to multiply. I will plug in the map range node, and I will slightly increase the 2 max value to 3 or 4. This will make the result even brighter. Now I'd like to use the math node to drive the strength of the emission. But the problem is that we have animated the strength of our emission, and I will lose this animation information. So what I will do is simply insert a keyframe on the multiply node and add exactly the same values as for the strength of the emission shader at the same time. 30, 10, and finally 0 on frame 90. We can now use the result to drive the emission strength. If we now preview our material by Ctrl-Shift left clicking the Mix Shader node, we can see that some sparkles are way brighter than before and others have turned to black. And this will change depending on their position in space because of the noise texture sourcing the object position of our empty object. The final touch is to drive the transparency of our material. I will duplicate the multiply node and I will drop it on the connection between the previous math node and the mix shader so that it will automatically be plugged. And I will plug in the second slot our map range node. Now our sparkle shader is finished. If you want, you can play with the number of particles, their size, their speed, but you now have all the keys to create your own sparkles. To make our explosion a little thicker, I'd like to add some smoke. It's gonna be pretty simple since we are going to use almost the same shader as for our explosion. So I will search for my explosion cloud mesh, I will duplicate it, give it a new name, and most importantly, we need to create a new material based on the existing material. Since we have duplicated the previous explosion particle object, our new object has the same material. To create a new material from this one, we just need to click on the number next to its name. This number indicates the number of objects that are currently using this material. Let's rename this newly created material. And now, since we are going to use it to generate a thick smoke, we don't need any emission. So we can unplug the color ramp or delete it. We can set the emission strength to 0. We can get rid of the previous map range that was driving it. And we can get rid of all the keyframes we've added on the first map range node by simply right-clicking and choose Clear Keyframes. From there, we need to reset the value of this map range node to something that will more or less look like a cloudy shape. I've used a value for the from minimum of 0.25 and 3 for the from maximum. Now let's just select our emitter, go to the particle system, create a new particle system. I will call it smoke. I will call also the particle setting smoke. This time we don't want a burst but a continuous flow of particles. So I will keep the end of the emission at 200 and I will try a number of particles of 300. We want our particles to rise, so I will set the gravity to 0, and now we can see our particle rising, but they are also disappearing. So we need to give them a lifetime that is longer than our animation, maybe 100 frames or even 200 frames. Now we need to render our smoke plane, so I will head to the render tab, choose object and source our smoke object. We can see that we have a lot of small dark dots into our explosion, meaning that the particles are way too small, so I will increase the scale of the particles and see the result. From there, our basic smoke particle system is done. What I will do is that I will tweak their velocity by reducing the initial velocity a bit and also the random velocity. And I will then add a very subtle negative value for the gravity. With a negative value for the gravity, the particles will rise instead of falling. A value of negative 0.05 should be enough. To better see the result of your smoke, you can head up to the particle systems and hide the first two particle systems. I will rename them so that it's easier for us to identify them. Then when I play the animation, I only see the smoke we have created. We can see that it's very thick and very opaque. What you need to do to deal with this is increase the scale of the particles and also play with the map range node. The higher the from mean value, the more noise and the more holes we will have in our smoke. You can also increase the from max value to get to this result. Using big particles will allow us to cover a broader cloud in a way. So I will head back to the emitter, choose my smoke particle system and increase the scale of the particles. Then I will select back my smoke object and I will work again on the shader. By reducing the scale of the noise texture, we will have a bigger noise that will look smoother. Then you can play with the contrast to build holes into your smoke cloud. So it's a lot of trial and error before you get to the desired result. So I will be tweaking those values for a while. And then I will make my animation length a little longer so that we do have the time to see the cloud of smoke rising. As I do this, I will also increase the lifetime of the particle to avoid them to disappear on screen. Then there are techniques to make the smoke dissipate while getting higher and higher, by using the distance between the particles and the emitter. But this is a little too advanced, and based on our framing, it doesn't really make sense. In the next video we are going to add a burst effect and also some kind of shockwave effect using the smoke and creating a ring around our explosion. This is the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and I will see you in the next and final one.